Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is Jim Kouzes. As you know, this is a LinkedIn Live interview show. We pose questions to thought leaders and doers like Jim, who will help us come to a greater understanding of ourselves. Grace Under Pressure reveals what's too often dismissed as the soft stuff, the caring, the connecting, the commitment we feel toward others. Grace for me is the generosity we share, the respect we show, and the commitment we demonstrate. And when you do it as a leader, you have to do it with ability to act for others and energize others for the greater good. Welcome, Jim Kouzes. It's a pleasure to have you, sir.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Okay. Well, I have known you for some 10 years, at least that, and you have helped me with my work and my writing, and you are an inspiration. And you are the co-author with Barry Posner of the award-winning and best-selling book, The Leadership Challenge. Now in its 6th edition with over 2.5 million, that's right, folks, 1 million sold. Jim is now a fellow with the Doer Institute for New Leaders at Rice University. Jim's co-authored over a dozen books, including Stop Selling and Start Leading, Leadership Learning, Truth About Leadership, and many, many more. He and his partner have also developed an instrument that I have used, which is the Leadership Practices Inventory, LPI. It's the top-selling off-the-shelf leadership assessment in the world, and I can recommend it because I've used it, and it's very easy to use. If I can use it, anybody can use it. Jim is a legend, truly. He's been considered one of the 10 best executive educators in the U.S. and received the Distinguished Contribution to Workplace Learning and Performance from the American Society for Training and Development. He's been regarded by one of HR magazines as one of the top 20 most influential thinkers, and on and on. And Jim's leadership career began when he was a youngster, I'll say that, January 20th, 1961. Jim says he was inspired to study leadership. Why? Because he was an Eagle Scout, and he served in John F. Kennedy's Honor Guard at the presidential inauguration. Ain't that special? Jim, welcome.
John, it's a pleasure to be with you, and thanks everyone for tuning in for 30 minutes while John and I chat.
Great. Jim, our world is upside down. What are you hearing from your clients or colleagues? What are we hearing?
Well, John, just this morning I was listening to the news, and here in California we're under another stay-at-home order, and so you can imagine what people are saying. The small business people in our local community, and I'm sure across the country, anyone who's experiencing this same kind of phenomenon is really scared. They're scared about losing their restaurants. They're scared about not being able to employ their workers. They're scared about all these changing economic conditions. That's really what's on people's minds right now. Looking forward to the vaccine and hoping that helps to move us out of this pandemic, but right now that's the biggest concern. Also, because of the protests that happened as a result of the George Floyd murder, that of course led us to focus once again on diversity, inclusion, and equity. That's another thing that is on people's minds as we talk, and of course on your and my mind in all of this challenge that we're facing. How do we develop leaders virtually? How do we continue to develop people while we're in this kind of context?
Okay. And so when you hear that, Jim, and I'd like your answers because I get it too, is, hey, I've got this leadership development program. Can we really do it virtually? And does it matter? What are you learning from the process?
Well, John, I have to tell you, I was really a skeptic at the beginning. I was, I've always done my work, as you probably have, face to face. I've been at this for nearly 50 years in a classroom experience or in a workshop, in an executive conference. And so everything's been face to face primarily, but we had to do something in our business in order to be able to respond during a pandemic. And I was quite surprised to find how people did adapt to this virtual technology, what we're using right now. and how the technology has advanced to the point where we can still do a lot of the things that we did when we were in person. We've had surprisingly positive results. Now, people are looking forward to going back into a context where they can be face to face and have that social intimacy that we're all in desperate need of right now. But I think we'll find a hybrid result. But I am just so impressed with how people have adapted to this and how we, as a business, have been able to adapt to this technology.
Right.
I think leaders are finding the same thing in terms of their own leadership, that they're utilizing this technology in ways that they probably didn't even imagine it.
Right. One of our colleagues, and I'm sure you know, Tasha Urich, has written and talked. And when I spoke to her, she said she likes the ability for the chat function because it's enabled her to, create a degree of connection with individuals, and maybe even better than in a large hall. So there are some benefits. So
yeah. And when you can create groups and breakouts and have people in small groups and chat. And, the other thing we've experienced is in a compressed time frame, people get kind of right down to it and have the dialogue that they might have taken more time to warm up to. And you don't spend a lot of time walking from room to room. You're right there immediately. So there are some advantages that people have used to make this work for them. And we've had very positive results.
Great.
Which we're thankful for.
Today I want to talk, we're a little bit early, but never too early, because the lessons resonate. And that's your brand new book, which is coming out is it May?
It's coming out January 20th. It'll be
January 20th.
released.
Good.
It's available for pre-order, but coming out January, released on the 20th.
Okay. And it's called what? You can see it on the screen right now. So
Everyday People, Extraordinary Leadership, How to Make a Difference Regardless of your title, role, or authority.
Great. Now, what intrigued me, because is you have something, this concept, or it's not a concept, but I like the way you're using it, called ordinary people. What's an ordinary person?
That would be all of us, wouldn't it?
So
we struggled a bit to come up with the appropriate title that would signal to the reader how this was different from our other books. And what we wanted to communicate in the title is that each one of us has the capacity to lead, regardless of whether we have a title as manager or executive or CEO or COO or CIO or whatever the C-suite title might be.
Right.
That everyone has the capacity to lead. In fact, John, just one little piece of data. When we did some research years ago, and we repeated it for this new book, Everyday People, Extraordinary Leadership, we asked people to tell us who their leader role models were. And what we discovered was that the most important leader role model was not a manager in a business, was not an executive at the top of a corporation, was not a presidential figure, was not a political figure, was not some famous person. As you might guess, it was a family member.
Oh, terrific.
Particularly parents.
Wow. Yes.
Almost 50% of people across the age spectrum identify a family member as their most important leader role model. And for younger people, under 25 years of age in our study, the second on the list was a teacher or coach. About 76% of leader role models came from those two categories for younger people. When you get into work, and you're starting to work and you're in your 30s, you're more likely to say the second person on the list as a leader role model was an immediate manager. Again, not the person at the top of the organization, but an immediate manager. So what that tells us is that we know that there are other people out there other than the famous ones, the people with titles, the people with authority who lead.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, not enough has been written about the leadership of those individuals. And so we chose, after all these years talking about it, that we decided to write a book just addressed to those people.
I love that concept, and it's something that I've actually been asked, and I'm sure you've asked 1,000 times, and is, who are your role models? And I often would say my parents. So, but they're also, and they say, well, who are your role? I mean, what leaders do you look at? And I would always kind of say, they would expect whatever generation we were in to mention some corporate leader, that person or whatever. And I'd say just what you said, look in your communities so often. And now I have research to back it up. So that's great.
Well, and we find, John, just to add to that those individuals whom we studied. So, John, you mentioned our leadership practice inventory. We took the leadership practice inventory and we looked at the data just from people who identified themselves as individual contributors. Mm-hmm. So these would be people who weren't in managerial positions, didn't have direct reports, were probably colleagues or team members. And we just took a look at them, and we took a look at their self-reports, and we took a look at those people who they identified as part of their team who gave them feedback on their leadership. Mm-hmm. And what we found was exactly what we found with people in managerial roles. We found that those individuals who more frequently demonstrated exemplary leadership practices had colleagues who reported them to be more effective as leaders than those who demonstrated exemplary practices less frequently. And so whether you are a person in a managerial role with a title or authority, or whether you're an individual contributor who has colleagues you're trying to influence, trying to lead, trying to take them to a place they've never been before, the exact same practices work, making you a more effective leader and creating more engaged constituents.
Would you call that peer leadership?
Our leadership model is the 5 practices of exemplary leadership. And so that's model, inspire, challenge, enable, and encourage. But it is a positive approach to leadership. It is based on what leaders do when they're at their best.
What's so reassuring about this is that A, leadership is accessible, and B, we've heard this cliche, but you have the research now to back it up. Leadership is not a title. So
it is a set of skills and behaviors. It's actions.
Great. You said, what's the most surprising research that you found in this book? Is it the fact that where we draw our leadership inspiration, or there are other things you want to share with us?
I would say that one of the surprises, it may not be a surprise as much as it is a reassurance, that the consistency in the data. And as I just said, when we take a look at the roles people play, whether it's a managerial role in the workplace or whether it's a community member outside of work who is just a colleague, a peer, mm-hmm. the extent to which you demonstrate exemplary practices, positive leadership, is consistent across all those groups. And so it's the consistency of data that's most impressive. In other words, when we first discovered this in our research, these practices, and we found that the more you, for example, model the way for others, and the more you inspire a shared vision, the more likely it is you'll have engaged constituents. And we found that, and we reported on 1987, our first book, we continue to find it today. So it's consistent. We're getting feedback that's consistent. And then if we slice the sample by role that people play, we get the same kind of results. So the context of leadership changes dramatically. We know that the context of leadership has changed a lot in the last 40 years, but the practices of exemplary leadership have not changed much at all. We know a lot more about them, but the fundamentals, are still the fundamentals.
That's great, and it gets to my next question. And you and your colleague Barry Posner have been writing for decades, as you said, and published a lot of books along the way. And I can attest to that because I think, and you kindly invited me to do a blurb for one of the editions of your book. I think it was the 5th edition of the Leadership Challenge, and I think I put something into the effect that I had seldom been in an HR person's office without seeing one of those 2.5 million copies of it. Literally, I would see them everywhere. So the question is, and I think I'm going to dig on this, what's changed in leadership? Because I get this question, so I want to hear it from you too. So,
well, the context is more what's changed, John, than the practices. Mm-hmm. You know, if I take a look at the data we gathered and reported in 1987, and I take a look at the data we just researched, we just got from our research for this current book, Everyday People, Extraordinary Leadership, we find how consistent it is. And so that tells us that what leaders need to do today is the same as leaders needed to do 40 years ago, and we expect they'll be the same 40 years from now. So what's important for us to understand is there is a difference between content and context. Today, the context, we started out talking about what's on people's minds. The pandemic is on people's minds. Right. Diversity, inclusion, and equity are on people's minds. That's contextual. That's the situation. I wouldn't be talking about pandemic 10 years ago. I'm talking about it now. Right. You're talking about it now. People are dealing with it. So what we do as leaders to model, inspire, challenge, enable, and encourage then has to adapt itself to the context. I think that's the most important thing for people to get about what's changed. John, another thing, let me use an analogy. Let's say we're learning a new language and we're learning to speak French, or we're learning to speak English, or we're learning to speak Spanish. The language of leadership, to use this analogy, doesn't need to change. We're still speaking that same language. We don't have to learn a new language of leadership, but we may be traveling to a different country, traveling to a different context, in which case we need to adapt ourselves to that context. We may have to learn some new words. We may have to study a bit more about that context in order to understand how to use the language in that context. But the language doesn't need to change. We don't need to learn 6 different leadership languages in order to be effective.
I'm great. I want to push on this a little bit because you opened our conversation with racial injustice, social injustice, and how critical that is. And I know you and I are both committed to making this inflection point lasting and get some sustained change. So we talk about diversity, inclusion, and equity, okay? And now though there are formalized processes, which is fine, but one of the things I have been exploring is personal bias, and we all have it. I mean, how does that lead into one's perception of being a leader? So,
one of the things we have learned, in fact, more recently, is the important role that mindset plays in how we think about a situation. Mm-hmm. And so, our biases reflect our mindset, our beliefs. And times like this invite us to examine our beliefs about healthcare, about public health, about how we work with people who aren't the same as us, who are different from us. And so they invite us to learn. And so I think what's important for leaders is to do what you do whenever you're asked to learn something new. Mm-hmm. You're asked to learn a new technology, to be virtual in this environment. We're now inviting leaders to learn new skills and abilities about how to work with people who don't have the same background as they do, don't have the same, haven't grown up in the same conditions they've grown up, don't have the same color of skin as they do, haven't experienced the same things in their life. We're inviting people to learn. And I think if we develop a learning mindset, a mindset about I'm being invited here to take a class. Being invited here to go to school. And one of the things we know about the best leaders is they're curious. They're open to learning. We will do better as leaders if we open ourselves up to learning from others, learning about their context and their situation, listening intently, trying deeply to understand, doing a bit more reading than we might have done about that. So, John, I think we can deal with our biases if we're open to learning. If we're not open to learning, that's a huge challenge.
One of the things I'm going to poke one more thing, because I've been asked this question and I don't have the research wherewithal. When I think of when people say what's changed in leadership, I always say, well, the principles have been there with us for millennia. What's changed, as you would say, the context. But the one change is the greater numbers, not enough, of women in leadership roles. How does that fit into your model and your studies?
So John, one of the interesting things that we did a couple of years ago was more like 5 when we did the last edition, 6th edition of Leadership Challenge. We took a deep dive into gender differences or differences by various demographics. And so when we examined the demographic differences, whether it's we ask about 10 differences from age to education to gender, we found something very interesting. Demographics, including gender, including education, including ethnicity, account for, wait for it, 0.3% of why a leader is effective. Individually by itself, gender accounts for next to nothing. In other words, there isn't any difference between when men and women engage in leadership practices, women and men, if they demonstrate exemplary leadership practices more frequently, get similar results.
Right.
So anyone who thinks that men are different from women when they lead, or women are different from men, or people of a different ethnicity are different from us when they lead, the data doesn't hold it up. The majority of engagement and performance as a result of leader actions is accounted for by how leaders act, not on who they are.
That is so refreshing because it shatters just about every stereotype there is, does it not?
It does. It does. It doesn't mean that as an individual, we should treat everyone exactly the same. We need to know who they are, what their backgrounds are, what their interests are, what their values are in order to appreciate them, in order to work effectively with them. But we don't need to, again, learn a new language if we're a female leader compared to a male leader or from a different ethnic background. We can all speak the same language if we just engage more frequently in the best leadership behaviors, positive leadership, exemplary leadership behaviors.
You just hit on something, which is what all good leaders do. And they have this implicit understanding is one size does not fit all. And I think that touches on our earlier topic about bias. Like, well, if I could do it, why can't Sally do it? Or why can't Kwame do it? Or whatever. So, and one size does not fit all in our treatment of those we lead, correct? So,
absolutely. We can't make an assumption that our experience is the same as somebody else's experience. And it's, we often advise people to just ask themselves one question whenever they come to interact with someone, if you want to have a positive influence on that individual. And that is simply, what can I do in this moment, whether it lasts a minute or an hour, to make sure that the person I'm interacting with feels more positive, efficacious, powerful, more respected, that their lives have meaning and significance than they did when we started this conversation or this interaction. And that can be a small act. It can be simply a nod of the head and showing I understand. It can be repeating back to the other person, paraphrasing to make sure you check for understanding. It can be, well, I based on what you just told me, I'd like you to talk to someone. I know someone who can be helpful to you with that problem. It might be some other kind of advice in a way of coaching someone to help them overcome a difficulty. But the fundamental, John, is when this person is done interacting with me, I want them to walk away feeling better about themselves than they did when we started.
Well, I think I would call that acting with grace.
Yes, you would.
But I'm biased on that. And grace,
Well, that's exactly what it is, John. That's exactly what
and
it is.
and grace is, you and I had this discussion, is it is transformative, but it's also a some action. I call it the intended acts of kindness. But your question is essentially, how can I make this interaction positive? That's
Yes.
that having that mindset. How can I change it? That's a sense of acting with grace, and that's what we.
That absolutely is acting with grace. And, it's really hard to do when fundamentally you just don't agree with that person and what they're saying.
Are you talking to me?
So hard. It just gets
Oh,
so
I know.
hard.
I can preach. But ask my wife how I come across sometimes.
I'm as guilty as anyone of struggling with that. But if we can stay open to that possibility that I can, and in any interaction I'm in with another human being, whether it's my son or whether it's my wife or whether it's my neighbor or my co-author Barry Posner or another colleague with whom I work, that I can have a positive impact on that individual if I simply behave in ways that make that other person feel better about themselves as a result of that interaction.
Right. And that takes work. And I'm glad you said that, because, and part of that work is that also the self-knowledge that I'm not going to get it right every time. I'm going to slip, but I'm going to try the next time. And I think it also gets back to what you were talking about. One size does not fit all. And that means it's a constant work in progress,
Yeah.
And I may not be your best manager on Tuesday, Jim, but on maybe Wednesday, we'll come to a better understanding. And that takes work.
Can I tell you a couple of stories?
Absolutely. Please do. So
I want to tell you two stories. One, to your last point about me, that I wasn't behaving at my best. It was in a meeting in a company where I was CEO of a consulting firm. And I had asked a new colleague to lead and facilitate a meeting. And she was doing well, but got to a point where I felt like some things needed to happen differently. So I jumped in and I sort of took over the meeting. And, at the end of the meeting, I was doing a little debrief with my coach. And the coach said, you interrupted Christy and you took over the meeting. And I'd written this book about all these exemplary behaviors of leaders. And I said, you're absolutely right, as I reflect on it. So I immediately got up from my office, went to Christy, and I said, Christy, I want to apologize. I asked you to run this meeting, and then I took over and ran it. And that must have made you feel really diminished. And I'm sorry. I promise you I won't do it again. And if I do, I want you to publicly let me know. To this day, Christy points to that moment as one of the most important leadership critical incidents in her life. That was just a little thing, an apology and a confession, but it demonstrates how we're not all perfect, but we can recover.
absolutely.
On a positive side, let me tell you one other story. We were doing a workshop, leadership challenge workshop, and I had invited one of the people about whom we wrote a story, Major General John Stanford, to come down and speak to us. He was very, he had great presence and he had lots of stories to tell. And John was the head of Military Traffic Management Command. He then moved on to be a superintendent of schools in Seattle Unified School District. So he led a very distinguished public service career. So John walked into the room, and there was a name tag for him, and there was a name tag for his aide de camp, Lieutenant Albert A. Cartenuto III. And so there were name tags laid out, and John picked up a name tag and put it on his uniform, his military uniform. And he walked up for his time to speak, and he was talking with everyone. And I noticed, John, you have the wrong name tag on it. It's Albert A. Cartenuto III. That's your aide's. Oh my God, that must be embarrassing. He picked up the wrong name. The whole time John was talking, I was worried that he was embarrassing himself in front of the group, and I wanted to do something to change, but I, of course, wasn't going to interrupt him. Got to the end of this talk, and he said, "Oh, by the way, I want to introduce you to Albert A. Cartenuto III. He's my aide de camp. I hope I represented him well."
Wow.
And I thought, oh my God, I was wrong. This guy did this on purpose.
Yeah.
He did this so he could, at the end of his talk, recognize somebody else and make them feel a little bit better about themselves than he did before he started. That's just an example of grace, an example of how we can intentionally use even making a speech wearing somebody else's name tag into an opportunity to show our respect for other people, to be generous towards somebody else, to make them become more credible in the eyes of others.
Oh, what a great story. And viewers of this show know that I asked people about a personal story of grace, and you've not only given me one, but two. So, Jim, we're coming to the end of where we are, and I want to bring your book back up on the screen one more time. And if I will, I lost the book. Sorry. Tell us what it is and where we can find you. My apologies, my friend. So.
No problem. You can currently pre-order on Amazon Everyday People, Extraordinary Leadership, that my co-author Barry Posner and I wrote, subtitled How to Make a Difference Regardless of Your Title, Role, or Authority. And it'll be coming out in January.
Great. Jim, you've been a wonderful guest, a man of grace. Thank you. It's been my honor to speak to you, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, John. It's really a pleasure being with you, and congratulations on your extraordinary work.
Okay.